if I suddenly collapse on the floor, well, obviously I was going to say don't mind me, but yeah, at some point last night just before going to bed, I had these sharp pains in my chest, and I thought, oh no, because I had pneumonia a couple of times a few years ago, but it doesn't seem to be that. But if I get too energetic and suddenly keel over or something, you know the reason. Anyway, hopefully that won't happen, at least not for the next 50 minutes. And I can drop dead afterwards and you won't mind too much. So let's get a move on. Firstly, two things. Firstly, I've had a couple more of the bibliographies / proposals and so on. If there's anyone else who hasn't given those in, give them in at the end, and I'll try and look at them all by Thursday and give you some kind of feedback or whatever. We've got 2 hours on Thursday. Secondly, tomorrow in the library in the afternoon, I have a big workshop, well, hopefully a big workshop, I don't know how many people are coming, a workshop about plagiarism and about a database we have that detects plagiarism. And so I won't be doing my office hours, so there's no office hours tomorrow afternoon. If you need, particularly Hassan, who's doing the presentation on Thursday, I'm around in the library, kind of running up and down the stairs and things in the morning, or else in the morning on Thursday, if we need to kind of chat about final arrangements and things like that. And for the rest of you, apologies, but between 1:30 and 3:30, I'll be in the library, not in my history office, if there's anything you need to contact me about, which I don't think there is, but just in case, I have to warn you. Okay, today and Thursday, we're going to look at, well, primarily, the events surrounding the 14th of October 1066, more famously known as the Battle of Hastings. 1066, as I think I said last week, is the kind of date which, at least when I was a little boy, which is a long time ago now, but when I was a boy, it was one of those dates that all the children had to learn in English history. I guess Turkish or American history has similar dates, but not necessarily 1066, obviously. You have a handful of important dates or whatever, and 1066 is that for England, or Britain, I suppose, but initially England. The Battle of Hastings was the point in which a gentleman called William, Duke of Normandy, successfully defeated the Anglo-Saxon armies and began the process of becoming King of England. Okay, Hastings, I don't know how clear that is, but this circled here to make it a bit clearer, this dot here is Hastings. There's still some argument about exactly where on the beach and so on the battle was, but we know it was in the vicinity of what's the modern town of Hastings. And William was Duke of this duchy, and I'll say more about Normandy in a couple of minutes. So someone who was not an Anglo-Saxon, someone who was a Frenchman, came and beat up the Anglo-Saxons and took over, okay, and effectively ended what we would call Anglo-Saxon England. There were still lots of people who were technically Anglo-Saxons running around England, but politically speaking, Anglo-Saxon England comes to an end with the Battle of Hastings and the death of King Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon independent king, and we get, not duck, what am I doing, you can't see, Duke with an E. At that point, we move into a new phase in English and therefore British history. Normal England is important in a number of ways, and we're going to explore that next week and the week after primarily. But Normal England is important. It marks not only a political break, it's a change in the political history because it's a new dynasty, it's a new set of kings and so on. Also, socially, it's argued to be important. For example, some people, particularly in the old days, used to argue that what we call feudalism, the way of organizing particularly the higher echelons of society, according to a certain system which historians have come to call feudalism, people have suggested that feudalism was only introduced into England following the Norman conquest by the Normans and so on. Others have argued the Anglo-Saxons had something kind of similar, but we wouldn't call it feudal and so on. So it's one of these debates. But that was one aspect of what you could call social change at the time. Cultural change. England, and by extension Britain, the rest of Britain and Ireland, become more connected to the continent, become more connected to particularly France, not just politically, and we'll explore that in the next few weeks as well, but in other ways. The culture of the ruling class is now the culture of Normandy and northern France and so on, okay, and including language. Since the time of King Alfred the Great, English as a language had had a great revival. I mentioned that very briefly. He had a kind of renaissance after he'd stopped the Vikings and so on. And the English language was used for many, many things, not just literature, administration, and all sorts of things in late Anglo-Saxon England. Once the Normans come in, that stops. Okay? Latin continues, but particularly for literature and other things, and for formal discussion in the court and so on, and higher parts of society, it's French which takes over. Okay. And the rest of the Middle Ages, we see the gradual re-emergence of English, but for the first period, particularly into the 12th century and so on, okay, English is hardly noticed at all. It's a very low focus. So that's one example of what we could call cultural change. In religious terms as well, okay, we see big changes in England. New religious orders, new monasteries founded by the Normans and so on coming in, partly as a result of the conquest itself. Okay. I have to stress that whereas the Viking settlements that we've been looking at, and whereas the Anglo-Saxon settlements that we looked at earlier involved a large movement of people, okay, coming in to Britain and establishing the English, or establishing up here Viking settlements. The Norman conquest did not involve lots of Frenchmen coming into England, and so on, okay. It was an elite movement. It was the higher warrior aristocratic class that were fighting with William, his supporters primarily, who were able to come in, take over the land of the Anglo-Saxons, and be the rulers. But we don't see a large demographic or population change. So it's a bit more like the Roman invasion, okay, where it's more something imposed upon an existing population rather than something which, up to a point, perhaps involves a lot of demographic shift and so on. So a very, very important point on a whole host of ways, politically and other ways. And we're going to explore some of these in a bit more detail, I hope, in the next few weeks. I've prepared a diagram of the main people that we will be discussing today. Okay, I'm going to hopefully do two things. Wait a minute, that's not complete. We're going to primarily do two things today. Firstly, I'll say a little bit about who the Normans were, okay? And then secondly, we'll explore, again, the basic events in English history from round about the year 1000, so from the time of Ethelred the Unready, probably down to the reign of Edward the Confessor. Then we'll pick up with Edward, when on Thursday we'll move into the actual Battle of Hastings itself. And Hassan is going to give us a presentation about the actual battle and so on. And hopefully you have, if you don't have, I might have some spare copies, if you have the bibliography for this topic, and ask me at the end if you don't, we shall on Thursday also look at the Bayeux Tapestry online, and we'll be able to see what that tells us about the Battle of Hastings. It's a kind of medieval comic strip or something like that. It's a different kind of source, and it's quite interesting, and we'll feed that in, tie that in with hopefully the things which Hassan will be telling us. Okay, any questions yet? No? Okay, quickly then. Here is a map, I hope, if this thing can focus, of Normandy. So remember, here is Normandy, northern France, just across what we call the English Channel from England, not the closest place, areas of Flanders, very short distance between England and there, but relatively close. Okay. And here is a slightly more detailed map. So, who were the Normans? Can anyone remember, either from now or previously, who were the Normans? And don't say Norman Stone, our venerable professor here, though his name. Sorry? Yes, their descendants. Norman technically means North man, which is one of the common, or not uncommon words for Vikings in early medieval sources, and it's been contracted into Norman. In the early 10th century, traditionally in the year 911, the king of Western France, or Western Francia, called Charles, and known later as Charles, not of, Charles the Simple, he came to an agreement with one of these gangs of Vikings that were sailing around, in this case, northern France, and basically said, okay, boys, rather than kind of fighting with us and causing trouble, we'll give you a bit of land, and you be good boys, settle down there, become Christian, part of the deal, okay, convert to Christianity, settle down, have this land, and kind of stop being Vikings, in a sense. And it was one of the ways, treaties, and we've already mentioned the concept of Danegeld a couple of weeks ago, paying money to keep the Vikings away, in this case giving them land, maybe getting them to fight against the other possible Viking attacks and things like that, okay. Similar in a way to what some people did in the late Roman Empire with the Germanic invaders and so on. And the land that seems to have been given to these Vikings under their leader Rollo is this eastern section of Normandy. This is rather specific. I don't know how specific the treaty was, but that's the main thing. Okay, so they get land, including the town of Rouen, which very important town, and they agree to become Christian and settle down and so on. 924. Okay, the king of Francia at that time, called Ralph, makes a further grant of land, pushing them further westwards. This central part of what is now Normandy is given. And then in 933, that's a 9 there, I'm afraid. This extreme western part, including what we call the Cotentin Peninsula up here, was given to the successors of Rollo. I think at this point it was his son called William Longsword. So it's a political kind of takeover of a small part of France with the sort of agreement of the French kings. Okay. Originally, Rollo and his successors were called the Counts of Rouen, okay, which had been an old title. They take over an existing noble title. But then as things expand, eventually they start calling themselves dukes of this new land, which becomes the Northman land, or Normandy as we've got it there. In addition to this political takeover, we do see a certain amount of Viking settlement, Scandinavian settlement coming in. So Vikings have got the land, and like in England, therefore, some other guys come in and start settling down. The place name evidence points to particularly this region and then the slightly later area there. Okay, these seems to be the two main foci for Scandinavian settlement. I've coloured on here so we can actually see them in context, but we've got, for example, this map here of the Cotentin Peninsula, and it's not so clear to you, but there's two kinds of blob on here. One showing it says a Scandinavian personal name and a Frankish suffix. So this again is a hybrid kind of name, which means when you come in and take over, there must be some contact. It's not the Vikings are coming in and saying, kill, 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 kill. Okay, we'll live here. What's it called? They don't know, so they give it a name. There must be some contact with the people. They're calling it, I don't know if it's Rollo's Ville or something. So they're using ville, villa from what the French are saying. So there's some contact, some interaction, and so on. And then this is just the same kind of thing for the earlier eastern region there. There's Rouen, see a bit further south on the southern edge of the main settlements as well. It's not a massive settlement, okay, focused particularly in these northern regions, and the other areas obviously have a certain amount of Scandinavian settlement, but nothing near as much of these areas. And so still probably the Scandinavians in Normandy were in a minority, not a large number of them. And gradually, and definitely by the 11th century, by about 1000 and later, okay, the Viking Scandinavian character of these people had more or less disappeared. Probably you had Scandinavian men coming, marrying French or Frankish wives, and then becoming kind of Frankish themselves. So by the beginning of the 11th century, Normandy was primarily Frankish. They remembered their Scandinavian origins. They were kind of proud to say, we are Scandinavians and so on. They remembered the stories about Rollo and whatever. But they didn't speak Old Norse. They were Christian. They didn't have kind of Scandinavian practices so much and things like that. Some people have said the reason they were so successful, the reason they were successful in conquering England and doing other things, and we'll mention those in a minute, is partly because of their strong military Viking tradition. That may or may not be true. We can't really prove those things. Everyone was fairly strong and military in those days, so obviously it's one theory and so on. So over the next century or so, after the time of Rollo, the Vikings become assimilated with the local population. And we see the emergence of this duchy as a part of the French political scene. Now, can either Azra or Özge remember anything about the situation in France at this time? If you cast your minds back 12 months or not to my, no doubt, extremely interesting lecture on this subject. Or maybe we had a presentation, I can't remember. Do you remember anything, or what's the situation in France overall at this time? And how does that feed into people like the Dukes of Normandy?
Feudalism was very strong
right.
at those times in Normandy.
Okay, feudalism, that's important. But what about, I mean, the kings of France? What were they like? What were the kings? I don't mean kind of were they nice men or bad men, or did they eat onions or something, but I mean, politically speaking, what was the situation of? We're talking here about the last of the Carolingians and the early Capetian kings of France. Now, what do we know about these people? Now, they were relatively weak, okay, for a number of reasons, including, it might be suggested, the effects of feudalism and so on. But central power in France was fairly weak, and for some effective purposes, the last Carolingians, especially the early Capetian kings of France, at the end of the 10th century, they had little power apart from the region around Paris and this area that we call the Ile-de-France and so on, okay? And the actual ability to control and tell people what to do in Normandy or other parts of France, further down south in Aquitaine or something like that, was rather limited, okay? Because of political reasons, because of the Viking period, because of the nature of feudalism and other things, okay? Central monarchy was weak in France that time, and that allowed the various dukes and counts in France, some of them more than others, to reinforce their own power within their regions. And the Dukes of Normandy were one of the more successful rulers to establish something which was almost like a little kingdom. Okay, no one could come in and tell them what to do, even though these guys were the vassals of the King of France, even though he was their boss feudally. Okay, he had no real effective power over them. So they had their own little semi-polity or pseudo-kingdom, in effect, within the overall Kingdom of France. And William was one of the more successful of these. He was a very successful duke in this sense. Okay? So Normandy was an area of, politically speaking, northern France, which had a strong Viking tradition, though that had disappeared. It had its own identity. They spoke their own kind of French. We call it Norman French. Okay, and politically speaking, it was relatively independent of central authority, and the Duke was a very powerful figure. The Normans themselves, as well as conquering England, they were a very important feature of the First Crusade, the first movement eastwards by Christians at the end of the 11th century. Okay, and they contributed to other ones as well. They became a different group of Normans had earlier become active in southern Italy, setting up a separate situation there. And also there's evidence of some Norman activity in what's now Anatolia, in Istanbul, and in parts of Anatolia as well. Okay, so they were not all of these were involved with the dukes, of course, but they were quite famous or infamous in the medieval, in the central Middle Ages for these activities. Their significance for us and the way they feed into our story, which is the story of Britain and England, is initially this lady, Emma of Normandy. We'll say more about her in a minute, but she was from the family of the Dukes of Normandy. Okay, her brother was Duke, and she married firstly Ethelred, the Anglo-Saxon king, and then later Canute, the Danish king of England. Okay, and her sons, by both husbands, okay, laid a claim to the English throne, but they had links to Normandy. And during political periods, particularly when Canute's sons are in power, Emma's sons by Ethelred, and had to flee somewhere, had to get out of England, and they went to Normandy. And Edward the Confessor, for example, spent a large part of his childhood and youth in Normandy. He grew up as a Norman. Okay, and during his reign, when he became England, Normans were involved in kind of running things in England and so on. So through this marriage, Normandy and England begin to kind of get connected. And as we shall discuss in more detail on Thursday, there is a tradition, supported by the Normans of course, that Edward, because he didn't have a son to succeed him, said that Duke William, who was his kind of distant relative through all of this, that Duke William could become his successor in England. Okay, and that was one of the things which William claimed. When Harold becomes king, after he dies, William says, hey, what about me? He said I could become king. Then he gets his army ready and goes in, and we'll discuss all this on Thursday. So we've got the Emma connection, and through her sons, particularly Edward, spending time in Normandy, and then this claim that Edward had named William his successor. These are the features, the Norman picture that we see feeding into the Battle of Hastings in the background, and so on. Okay, any questions there? All right, let me just put this map up now. It's just a map of kind of England that we can refer to. And what I shall sketch now is the events from the reign of Ethelred down to the succession of Edward. Okay, so from about 1000 down to 1042. Okay, and then we'll pick up the story 1042 onwards next week. First I shall clean the board. Okay, so we start with this guy here, and his nickname, Ethelred the Unready. And I think okay, here is more or less contemporary picture, no doubt not very lifelike and realistic, but from a medieval manuscript. I don't know which one, but the style looks as if it's pretty contemporaneous or something, 11th century or something like that. Okay, here is a picture for us to look at. What did I say the other day about this nickname? All these nicknames are called sort of later. Usually people aren't called these things when they're alive, these kings. They get these nicknames later on by historians writing 100 or more years later. Unready, I mentioned this briefly. Sorry?
Unready for ruling.
Kind of. I mean, okay, unready now means kind of, hey David, are you ready? We're going. Well, actually, hang on, I've got to put my coat on. I'm not quite ready, or my shoes, or something like that. It doesn't mean that, okay? Rad means counsel or advice or plan or something like that. And unrad means bad counsel, bad advice, something like that, okay? His reign was not greatly successful. People invaded, he lost the kingdom for a short while, things like that. And there are suggestions that he had bad advisors, bad supporters around him and things. So unready there doesn't mean he's not ready to go yet. It means he was badly advised, he had bad counsel or something like that, okay? Athelred was son of King Edgar, one of the important guys we mentioned from the late 10th century last time. In 1002, he became married to Emma of Normandy, whom I mentioned before, and he had a previous wife called Althgifu, who was from York. I've put that down because Canute also had some kind of relationship with someone called Althgifu, a different lady, and she was from Northampton, so they're not the same individual. Okay. His reign, particularly once we reach the middle of his reign, was characterized by a series of attempts by people from Denmark to invade. It's a kind of second wave of Viking activity, but in this case, it's a political invasion and led by kings. Okay, and one of the main people involved in these attacks was Svein Forkbeard, which means, I don't know if this is true or not, that he had a kind of little beard where the bits stick out like that, like a little fork or something. I should have looked for a picture of him actually, and then we might have found an image of him with his forky beard or whatever. And this is him up here. Okay, he's king of Denmark, and during the early 1000s, he makes a number of attempts to invade England. Okay, not all successful initially, so he's trying to push in. However, in 1013, Sweyn does succeed in establishing some power, initially in the Danelaw, just to remind you, in the traditionally Viking area in the north and east up here, okay, in parts of the old kingdoms of Lindsey and Northumbria, initially there, but by the end of the year as well, the southerners down in London accept him. They recognize his military superiority, okay? So for just under 2 years, okay, he becomes King of England, and Ethelred is left. He's not killed, he flees, and with his family, they head to Normandy, okay? They flee off to Normandy, his wife's home. Sweyn dies 1014, the next year, and his son Canute is unable to establish himself, and so he has to go back to Denmark, and Ethelred and his family come back. Okay, so they've had this brief, I wouldn't say interregnum because there was a king, but this brief kind of break where in fact he was king from 978 to 913, and then 1013, and then 1014 to 1016, to be kind of technically accurate. The following year, 1015, Canute, son of Sweyn, comes back. builds up an army in Denmark and says, I want to take over, pick up where my father left off. So then he tries to establish himself. Okay. During this period, Ethelred is getting older and he's quite sick, and some of the power is passing to his son Edmund, okay, known as Edmund Ironside. So for a while we have three powers. We have Canute asserting himself, we have the aging and dying King Ethelred, and then we have Edmund. Ethelred dies in, I think it's April 1016, and then for a short while his son Edmund claims to be king, but then he dies in November of the same year, so he lasts less than a year, and then Canute is accepted as king by the English. So briefly we have Sweyn, and now we have a Dane, his son Canute, as king. Okay, so this is the first phase of the end of the Anglo-Saxons, in a sense. Canute reigns for almost 20 years, 1016 until 1035. So that's quite a long period of time, okay, to establish your role and to change things a bit. One of the first things he does is to marry Emma, Ethelred's widow. Okay, why would he do that, do you think? Because he likes French girls. No. Why? Yes, one possibility, because Sweyn and then Canute have really got no claim to the English throne. They're not in any way claiming descent from earlier kings. So marrying the wife of one of the previous kings gives you some connection, okay, to try and legitimize your power. Plus, there is the danger that the Normans might fight against you. Okay? If Emma and her sons run back to Normandy and say, oh, it's terrible and these Danes have come and kicked us out and can't you help us? The Normans might have thought, this might be something, there might be something in this for us, and they might try and move in. But by marrying Emma, okay, he kind of puts a stop to this possible threat from Normandy. Whether or not there might have been something, I don't know, or whether it was even planned. Okay. However, Emma's sons by Ethelred, including Edward, okay, do go back to Normandy. So a new setup is arranged. She more or less drops her English sons and then establishes a new set of relationships with Canute. Canute already had some kind of relationship going on, whether she was his wife or kind of extra lady, Althgifu from Northampton. Okay, and this sets up a problem because then he's got these two rival sons, Harold Harefoot by the extra lady, and then Hartha Canute by the new wife Emma. So when he dies, okay, we're going to have succession problems emerging. We're going to have problems emerging because we've got rivals from different mothers, and so on. So during this 20-year period under Canute, we see a number of things happening in England, which kind of prefigure or are not too dissimilar to what happens when William comes in 40 years later or so. Firstly, Canute puts a lot of his Danish supporters in key positions, okay, political positions, positions of authority in England. He promotes his Danish, or sometimes called Anglo-Danish, supporters. Duke William does the same thing with Normans and Frenchmen, but on a much larger scale later on. But it's a typical thing. You're taking over, you're not really in a very strong position. Your position is based upon the sword. You're bound to get people going against you. So what you do is you put your people you can trust, who are the people who fight with you, into the big places, into the main places in the kingdom. And one of the things we see also related to this during this period is the emergence of the position of earl, okay, which in fact comes from the Old Norse word jarl. Okay, the English word earl comes from a Norse term or title, and so on. Earlier, under the Anglo-Saxons, one of the main administrative and kind of military figures within the kingdom below the king was called an alderman. Okay? But under Canute, the alderman position is more or less replaced by these earls, and there are fewer of them. They control much larger positions and so on. And to some extent, he gives at least some of these positions to Danes. But they're the big guys who have a lot of power immediately under the king. And for us, the most important earls, and they're English earls in fact, were the Earls of Wessex. Okay, so they have power down in the southern part of England. And it's this guy called Godwine, okay, which I guess means something like friend of God, in fact, that name. Okay. His origins are perhaps a little bit obscure. They may have had some power in Sussex or something, I think, but primarily they are new people promoted under Canute, his family, okay? And he has a number of sons, and most importantly is his son Harold, who briefly becomes king later on, okay, who also succeeds as earl. So that's one of the big earl families. Other people that we shall mention, in Mercia, the middle area, we see the promotion of Leofric, who his family become very important in Mercia, and also we see the Earls of Northumbria in the north, and up there is a Danish guy called Siward who has power up there, and of course we've got lots of Scandinavian settlement up there as well. Okay. And during Athelred's reign, and to some extent under Canute as well, we see the growing importance of the sheriff, which technically means the shire reeve, underneath the earl. England, during the early part of the 11th century, more or less finally is organised into what we call shires. Okay, they still exist in England today: Yorkshire, Northamptonshire, okay, and others. The counties, the main administrative divisions that exist even today. And they were established very slowly from perhaps the very early period in Wessex, and spreading as the English kings reconquered up to the north and established the final shires in the Danelaw and so on. And it's during this period, Athelred and then Canute, that process kind of is finished, and we see the final shires emerging. And the sheriff is the main representative of the king in the shire. Okay, and then above him, controlling a number of shires, but being less directly involved in administration, was the earl. So we see during this period the sort of important aspect or character of English medieval administration emerging. In addition, and I found my other picture, Canute, perhaps inaccurately, is most famous for doing this, which is sitting on a beach on his throne and supposedly telling the sea to stop coming in. And here, the more traditional but inaccurate spelling of Canute is often given. Okay, Canute commanding the sea to stop. Now, in fact, according to our very reliable source, Wikipedia, this tradition first occurs in the 12th century historian Henry of Huntingdon. Okay, we have a copy in the library, but I didn't have time to go and pick up that. But here's what it says. He says, okay, Henry of Huntingdon relates how Canute set his throne by the seashore and commanded the sea to halt, the tide to halt, and not wet his feet and his robes, his clothing. But the tide failed to stop. The sea didn't stop. It kept coming in. Now, according to Henry, according to the writer, Canute leapt backwards and said, "Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, for there is none worthy of the name except he," capital H, this means God, "he whom heaven, earth, and sea obey by eternal laws." Okay, so he's basic, and then he takes his crown off and says, "I'm not going to wear my crown again," or something, "I'm not worthy of being called king. The only true king is God." Sort of, a human should not call himself king. So this is, is traditionally and originally represented as an example of him being a fairly humble guy and a fairly pious guy, okay, not making himself out to be important. But more recently, when people talk about this story, it's to show how ridiculous it was that he said, I'm the king and I could even stop the sea, whereas he's making the point that I can't stop the sea coming. So it was the wrong way around, okay. During his reign, a little bit later than getting England, he also becomes King of Denmark, so he was quite a powerful person. But he spent most of his time focusing on England, and he sent, I think, Harthacnut off to Denmark, okay, to work there for him. And he also controlled at least some of Norway for a while and sent one of his other sons off to deal with Norway, and he focused on England. Canute dies 1035 after a fairly long reign, okay, and then we have a problem because we've got two claimants. He's got more than two sons, but these are the main claimants by two different kind of English or Anglo-Norman wives. Earl Godwin of Wessex, one of the more powerful guys in England, he supports Harthacnut, but Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, supports Harold Harefoot. However, Harthacnut is kind of stuck in Denmark, doing things in Denmark, and for a couple of years kind of nothing happens in terms of who becomes king, but finally in 1037, because Harthacnut is still stuck in Denmark, Harold becomes king. He's proclaimed king. Okay, so there's a period of kind of division and uncertainty, and then finally he becomes king. But he only rules for 3 years. He dies in 1040, and then Harthacnut comes over and says, okay, I'm fully king, there's no challenge to me now. Okay, he returns with his mother and sets himself up as king. His reign is not very successful. He was not entirely successful, becomes unpopular, and he even has to accept Edward the Confessor, his half-brother, okay, through his mother. He even accepts Edward the Confessor as his heir, as his successor, as the next king. And so when he dies, when Harthacnut dies in 1042, Edward steps in. Okay, so that was a kind of basic chronology that I wanted to sketch today. The main points that we can see from this kind of complicated diagram. Well, I've done this diagram deliberately to show how everyone's connected to everyone else. There's an English song, the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone and all that. Everything's connected somehow. It doesn't have to mean that's how people claim to be this and that, but it does show how kings and higher aristocracy were interacting. They lived in the same world. They were married to each other and things like that. And even the Godwin sons, Harold Godwin's son, briefly King of England after Edward, okay, through a kind of various marital connections, is connected to Canute and therefore even to Ethelred and so on. They can make claims from that. But the important thing is to see the growing importance of the Norman connection set up primarily by Emma, okay? And as I said before, as we'll mention again on Thursday, it's very important, particularly for Edward, for his background and also his reign, and it provides the kind of immediate reasons for the Norman invasion in 1066. Okay, any questions? Anything not clear? Okay, so on Thursday, we shall look at the reign of Edward fairly briefly, just the main points and so on. As a background to looking at the Battle of Hastings, we shall focus on who claims to be King of England in 1066. There are in fact 3 people, you could say, who are claiming to be king after Edward, and we'll look at all their claims. This all leads to the Battle of Hastings, the invasion by William, which will be the focus for Hassan's presentation, and probably at the end, after the presentation, we shall go online and look at the Bayeux Tapestry, parts of that, and how it can tell us political propaganda, as well as helping us to reconstruct historical events using a rather different format than the one that historians are used to. Okay, thank you very much. See you all on Thursday. Again, if anyone has got bibliography or draft plans and so on, plans, please give them to me now, and I shall do my best, workshops in the library permitting, to give them back on Thursday with some feedback and comments and things like that.